Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our retreat, our planning retreat of the Racial Justice Task Force. It's really great to be gathered both here among us in the sanctuary and those logging in by Zoom. It's, I don't know, probably 2/3 here in the nave and another third of you here. A great turnout. Thank you for spending your Saturday in this important work of continuing to build beloved community in the context of our church as St. Margaret's. My goal just in this opening introductory remarks is to just give you a roadmap of what the plan is for the day, reminding us of where we've been to inform where we're headed. We'll do reflection together and then take a break and then come back together and do more forward-looking planning for next steps. So part one is reflection, part two is action. I had a lot on my heart and mind, especially when Diana, our facilitator who I'll introduce in a moment, David Waycaster, and I have been planning this day in conversation with Jackie and Annika as well. And one of the key points I've been taking away, it comes from you, David, reflecting on how much things have changed in many ways for the worse in our country since when we began this journey of sacred ground in the first class. But at this point at St. Margaret's, we've had 3 cohorts in the first class. Those were who was part of those first 3? Show of hands. That just gives us a sense too. Online, thank you. And then two more cohorts who just concluded this past June. So a good mix of us, 3 groups the first times, 2 groups the second time. By our count, 41 total people at St. Margaret's. That includes, may she rest in peace, Rhonda Williford, who's no longer with us. So 40 people who were our target audience to participate today. So a good turnout. Thank you all for the dedication of the work. The overarching goals of today are to continue to build community as those of us who are invested in this work. You're the inner circle of those who've raised your hands. You've shown up, you've given of your time, your hearts in reflection. And for those who've been part of the Racial Justice Task Force in the past year, you also have already made a big difference in the life of St. Margaret's. And we'll say more about process in the second half. But by virtue of all of you being here, you are invited presently to be part of the work moving forward. And that's for you to discern in what way that would look like for you. But everyone's a part of it moving forward. So with that, I think I'm gonna turn it over to David so that we can begin getting to know who he is and pray and start.
Good morning, everyone. I'm David Waycaster. I am the rector at Grace Church in Georgetown, so just sort of in that direction over there. I have been there for a year, so that's but I've been in the Diocese of Washington since 1994. I was just telling Elizabeth that I moved here in 1994 for 1 year, which is not an uncommon experience from a lot of Washington people. I came here to be a member of the Cathedral Volunteer Service Community, which is a forerunner of the Episcopal Service Corps. I was the rector of Good Shepherd in Silver Spring for 12 years, and before that, I was an assistant at St. Luke's in Bethesda. I am a past co-chair of the Race and Social Justice Committee for the Diocese, and I have been an anti-racism trainer both in our diocese and in Province 3. I have helped facilitate Sacred Ground at least 3 times, maybe 4. We were having a conversation about that before we got started. And I grew up in the Diocese of Mississippi, so I have lived and breathed race from the very beginning in a very overt way that I think a lot of people haven't. And I grew up going to public schools, that's an important piece of my formation. But I was public schools after integration in the South, which is also, so I personally don't remember the desegregation of public schools. But I heard lots of stories, and I'm sure as you are all aware, Mississippi is a very complicated place to this day. And it tends to be easy to pick on, and it tends to be a microcosm of sort of race relations, particularly African Americans and those of us who are descended from Europeans, a microcosm. And for those of us who grew up there, we tend to see things solely in black and white, except that now there's also a large Latino or Latinx population that has immigrated as well. And so now it's all of the traditional binary has suddenly become a triangle. And so it's really interesting and fascinating to watch. I really believe that this work is extremely important. And the reason I believe this is that I believe that the role of the church in the 21st century is to bring all different kinds of people together and enable them to be in relationship with each other, and to really be in right relationship with each other. The church is among the last of the institutions in our broader culture and society that deliberately brings everyone of all classes and races and gender expression and sexuality together and expects them to be in relationship with one another. But we cannot be in right relationship with one another if we're not able to be our authentic selves. And I think that we're, all of us, called to be brave enough to be our authentic selves. And so I would like to invite everyone who's physically here and online, hello everyone, good to see you, to consider this a brave space. Now you may have heard the term safe space, but this is actually a space to take risks. And I will just remind all of us that we're all human beings. And so we might say something that causes someone else to go, ooh. So if you hear something that sort of startles you, feel free to say ouch out loud. And then we'll just sort of take a pause and deal with it. But I also I want to note that for those of us who are white, we have been socialized not to talk about race. We have been socialized that it is rude to talk about race, and overtly and implicitly, this is a message that we have all internalized. So, and this is part of white privilege. You know, the whole idea that we can be in spaces where there are a majority white people or all white people, and we just don't have to talk about anybody who doesn't look like us. That is not the experience of people of color. And, you know, for a person of color, they are thinking about race consciously and unconsciously every time they step outside their front door. There's an emotional burden to that. It's an emotional labor to that, that many of us who are white, that's just not part of our daily lives and our daily routine. And so part of this, what I love about Sacred Ground, is the consciousness raising piece. Now, I will also say, it's not going to make you feel good all the time, right? And it may even make those of us who are white feel either ashamed or guilty or both. Now, here, and I want you to listen to me very carefully. If you are feeling either shame or guilt, get over it. Because both shame and guilt are paralyzing emotions. And if any of us who are white in this process feel our shame and guilt, there is no incentive to change the status quo. And we can get stuck in feeling shameful or guilty and never do anything. So part of the work that those of us who are white have to do is to build up the resilience to live with this, you know, our role, our ancestors' role in creating these systems that differentiate and give us privilege at the expense of people of color. And so I think that's actually, sometimes that's a hard thing for people to wrap their head around. But it's very important. And so I also want to say, as you move forward in these conversations, I am more than happy to have individual conversations with you. If you would like to have an email exchange or meet for coffee or something, any of you, I would be happy to do that. And so I'd like to thank Richard and Diana for having me here this morning. And I'll just take a minute to see if you have questions of me or anything that you would like to add at this point in time. All right. So I also want to say, well done, St. Margaret's, for having 2 big cohorts of people go through Sacred Ground. I also want to say that I think that's, as I was talking to Patty before we got started, there is something about this program that makes this subject very accessible in a way. Like, this has been the most successful of all the anti-racism initiatives that I have witnessed in the Episcopal Church in the 30 years I've been in this diocese. So thank you. And I want to thank you too, because as I mentioned earlier, this is not a comfortable conversation, especially for those of us who begin to realize the implications of white privilege and the implications of benefiting from entire systems that really are designed to privilege people who are white over and above everyone else. And so the more we have these conversations, the more we all raise our consciousness, the more we are able, the more those of us who are white are able to listen to and believe the experiences of people of color. It's really, I think that's really important. That's really important work. And a question I have is, well, what can I do? Because this seems like a huge, big task to dismantle all of these systems, and it is. But there are little things, there are small things that you can do. And so one of them is, and I was famous for telling my parishioners at Good Shepherd this, when you are in a position where you're dealing with someone who is in a service position, a server, the checkout person at the grocery store, the person who's handing you your latte, look them in the eye and say good morning. Resolve that you're going to acknowledge their humanity and that the bond that you share as both people being created in the image and likeness of God. Practice this. Because it is, once any of us begins with these little tiny steps, then the bigger things get easy as well. There's not any one reaction to all of this. So some of us are going to want to get very involved in advocacy efforts. Great. Some of us are going to want to get very involved in education efforts. Excellent. Some of us are going to want to have book studies. That's good too. But try to remember that just having the conversation and actively calling and taking appropriate opportunities to call attention to the dynamics involved in our culture is actually working to dismantle the system. And I will also say it is increasingly a challenge because, as Richard alluded to in his introduction, culturally, politically, we're in a very different place than we were in 2020. And, we're beginning to see real pushback against these kinds of efforts. So don't get discouraged, because as Christians, we live in hope of the resurrection. And so our default setting is hope. And, we know that death is not the final answer, because Jesus died and then rose from the dead. So we know that we live in that hope. And my hope is that this conversation this morning will be the continuation of a rich and fruitful conversation that enables all of you at St. Margaret's to have right relationships with each other, but also to bring in other people, to welcome them, to continue to be hospitable, and to really build a vision, a real place of the kingdom of God. And then there's also a caution here. So if you imagine this work as an arc, and way over here is denial, and way over here is sort of enlightenment, and in between are sort of all the different phases of this work. And the further you get along this arc, the harder it is to have empathy and tolerance for people who are over here. So I will also say to you that the more you engage in this work, the more important being in touch with your own emotions and your own feelings is. It's really important, because being self-righteous makes me feel really good, but it doesn't do very much to build up relationships. So I think that will just caution you that the more you engage in this, you might find yourself very frustrated with people who've never thought about it before. But just remember that particularly for people who are white, that's the default setting of our culture. You know, we don't, and so which is actually the important piece of talking about this, is the idea that representation matters. Yeah, and so this is, and those of you who are LGBTQ plus know, it's really important to see people who are like you in television programs and movies and books. In the same vein, it's really important to be able to talk about this issue. It's really important to risk sounding dumb. It's really important to risk sounding racist, because if we don't take those risks, we're not going to learn how to resolve and do better. And so when someone says, ouch, take that moment to reflect. If you need to apologize, apologize, and do better next time. And remember that none of us are expected to be perfect, and that all things are being perfected in God, but none of us are expected to be perfect. So I hope this is helpful. And our first task this morning is to break up into groups of 3 or 4, and we have some questions to answer. And so if you could go ahead. What? Oh, right. That's right. Yes, sorry. Allow me to pray first. So this is a prayer from the prayer book, Prayer for Social Justice. The Lord be with you. Almighty God, who has created us in your own image, grant us grace fearlessly to contend against evil and to make no peace with oppression, and that we may reverently use our freedom. Help us to employ it in the maintenance of justice in our communities and among the nations, to the glory of your holy name. Through Jesus Christ our Lord, who lives and reigns with you in the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. Amen. So, now we're going to break up into small groups. If you could arrange yourselves in groups of either three or 4. It doesn't matter. We're not, if you just finished or did Sacred Ground 18 months ago, those mixed groups are fine. Yeah.
So Diana is describing what the in-person folks should do to divide up. And for those of you on Zoom, I'm going to put you into 2 different breakout rooms. So that should roughly account to there being 3 or 4 of you to talk. But let's let David finish giving us the prompts, which are also listed in the agenda, Zoom folks, if you're using that as a tool.
Okay. So here are our prompts for this morning. For those of you who participated in Sacred Ground in 2021, 2022, what are our reflections on racism and the experience of Sacred Ground 18 months later? Where do we see ourselves in the parish in terms of growth toward anti-racism? For those of you who just finished Sacred Ground, what have we learned from our experience of Sacred Ground? How have we been changed? And what do we understand now that we did not before? And actually, those questions work for both groups. So, if you answer the question, you're feeling called to. But so we'll see you back about 10:45. Or do you want to come back at 10:40 and then? Oh, sorry. Okay, so we'll be back here at 10:30. All right, so we'll come back as a group of the whole at 10:30.
Welcome back. There's one more group in the corner that needs to come back.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. My little group had a very rich conversation, so I hope that was everybody's experience. We're going to take about 15 minutes to report back, and then we're going to take a break. So, who would like to go first? Oh, okay, great. Okay.
So can you hear me? Yeah. We had 4 or 5 main points. The first realization, this was by someone who took the Sacred Ground 2 years ago, was just the growing sense that things are worse than she had realized. And she'd been aware of racism before, but now she was really aware of that it's not racism per se, it's this larger sense of systemic built-in discrimination. So an awareness that it's all around us. It's in the water we drink. It's in the way we give food to people, the way we educate people as a country. So this being trapped by systemic racism, that it's sort of built into how we do things. Another point that someone else made was, or a couple people in our group said, sadly or positively, learning all these things brought a greater sense of discouragement. Oh my God, it's really worse than I thought. What can I do? It's just depressing. This sense of falling into that despair, that discouragement. And then being paralyzed by it. So discouraged, and then that brings up one's own sense of shame and guilt and not knowing how to move beyond that, shame and guilt. One person recognized in terms of her own personal interactions, the things that she'd done or said in the past, upon reflection and education, she's now like, oh my God, did I do that? She realizes that things that she'd said were perhaps insensitive, were perhaps hurtful to the person of color that she said this to, and she'd meant it well, but hadn't realized what the cues were that she was giving. And now has a greater sense of when she interacts with people, to watch herself, to have more control, to have more awareness and sensitivity. 2 more things, and other people said they just make, in terms of how they've been changed, they are much more aware and put much more energy into connecting with people. So looking the person in the eye, especially, whether it's a salesperson, whether it's a colleague, or whether it's having dollars in your billfold ready to give out to people on the street who are asking for money, so that you can give them something, but you also have an opportunity to then interact. And then finally, and this was a big point of, for a couple of people, was the tension that arises within a family. You are now the one that sees things differently. And you have a sense of need to reflect that change to your family, and they're looking at you, but like, who are you? what is you're saying things that we as a family haven't agreed with before, and how do you have that communication with family? Does that sound good? People in, okay.
Okay. So we're gonna, if we can get one of the Zoom groups to report out now.
Can you hear me okay in the sanctuary?
Yes, thank you.
All right. Good morning, everyone. This is Ray, and I'm reporting for Maggie, Sally, and Annika. And we've kind of talked about our reflections kind of in like sort of three phases: the individual level, kind of our communities, particularly St. Margaret's, as well as kind of we got ended with kind of like a national conversation, similar to kind of the first group as well. And kind of on the individual level, what we kind of reflected on in our learning was just kind of critically examining our lives. We all kind of come from different age ranges and stuff like that. So we had different experiences, but whether from, civil rights era to George Floyd, we kind of reflected on, our upbringings, where we came from, and, kind of challenging ourselves to continue this work forward. We also talked about the need to not take the foot off the gas, particularly as a faith community, in spite of a lot of this pushback that we've seen, whether it's a sort of an apathy, kind of like we did there, been there, done that, or just kind of a feeling that like, is it actually going to make a difference and stuff like that? So, and really kind of putting our money where our mouth is, so to speak, in whether it's something like the supplier procurement program or any other kind of things that we do as a community. Of course, I'm a horrible note taker on this one. We talked a little bit about sort of growth in the sense of being more comfortable in the discomfort in these conversations. Whether kind of like what the last group was said, being the person in the family, to sort of take this side, and also just being more comfortable to have the conversation, because I think with things like book groups and continual learning, I think I speak for the group where it's like we've done probably more work on this the last few years through Sacred Ground and other venues than we probably had for much of our lives, and gaining some confidence in being able to also be leaders in this. I think that's I speak for myself a little bit on that one, but to just be able to be someone who steps up in the work meeting, steps up in the church group and things like that. So, group members, have I missed anything?
No.
There's one thing I would add, which I think we talked about, was we know that some of us are newer to St. Margaret's, and it would be when this all started, the original facilitator group kind of formed out of congregation members, and there were members who had been in the congregation for 20 or more years, or longer periods of time. And it would be good to check in with those who have been a part of the congregation for a long time, to ask them what they think to what level does this looks like a substantive shift, especially for our congregation members who are coming from African American or Asian American or Latino, Latinx, other backgrounds, to just say, do you think that this has shown that you're seeing substantive change in the congregation in your experience? So that's it.
Thank you, Maggie.
That's it.
So from our group's perspective, and from our group's perspective, is that good? In terms of new understandings and reflections, we focus on them first from a personal perspective, the consciousness raising, how invaluable has been, how we've developed more empathy. We talked about it, at least one person from a professional perspective, how eye-opening it has been in terms of their professional training and the impact of the legal system on racism. We talked about it from a social perspective, how one of us now feels that they bring up race in all white contexts and feel more comfortable sort of bringing up the subject. And then we talked about it from a family perspective as well, the impact of being able to pass on factual U.S. history to in a multiracial family context. So personal, professional, social, family, it had an impact across all those dimensions. In terms of growth, we talked first about the messaging at St. Margaret's and how it continues to be a very strong, welcoming message, including with respect to money not being an object and welcoming all economic levels. But then we contrasted that with how hard it is for a multiracial family to feel that they really belong here, where the parish is not as diverse as it could be in terms of welcoming a multiracial family. And we talked about the parish growth, but do we see manifested in the congregation more diversity, or are most of the newcomers all white? We talked about the supplier diversity program as a good thing, but a slow burn, and how it is allowing us to track now on a monthly basis our expenses, which is going to give us then some objective data to compare year to year in terms of how we're doing in reality, and how it has been slow to internalize, but it seems to be getting more traction. And then lastly, in terms of what we can do for more action, we talked on the one hand about the fact that we have 40 plus people who have taken this class, but on the one hand, is that too few, or are those already self-selected, previously engaged members of St. Margaret's, and what can they do to inspire more action? And the words there that seem to resonate for most of us were baby steps on the one hand, and then osmosis. Or is this something that is seeping through to the rest of the congregation? Anything else from my group? Yes, there was some questions raised in terms of, are we keeping data, or do we have data on whether or not our vestry has in fact participated to the 100% level in the course, as was one of the vestry goals?
Well, let me just first say that over the past 30 years, it's always been hard to follow Anamita, who has the power of synthesis, but I'll try. My group consisted of Anne, Ron, Lou, and David sat in. We began our reflections with personal stories. And I think through those personal stories, we saw that all of us had in our lives seen a certain level of meanness. And meanness seemed to be the overarching sentiment that our group has seen over the last 18 months, fed often by the 24/7 news cycle that was, or that has only expanded in the last 18 months. We also talked about the historical changes that have come to DC in the time that all of us have lived in DC, and how some of those changes, while positive, many are negative in terms of gentrification and pushing out communities of color from the city. We reflected that Sacred Ground really helped those of us in the group give voice and words to confront racist comments, racism in our families and online when we have seen it. That here at church, we feel that we have, through Sacred Ground, created a safe space to give voice to our thoughts. We talked also about the fact, since the first session of Sacred Ground completed, we have enacted a supplier diversity program, and most recently we have begun raising awareness through regular prayers in the prayers of the people that reflect on racism in a wide range of communities. Did I miss anything?
So now we can hear from the second Zoom group.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm Jackie Mackey, and I represent the illustrious group of Jenny and Steve and Julie Poulter and Rob Crittenton and myself. It's hard to follow all of you, and we concur with many of your reflections. One of the things that struck us was how important it is to be intentional as white folk in discussing and learning and acting related to racial justice. It doesn't happen automatically unless we want it to happen and make it happen. And one of our group mentioned how important the prayers of the people, our new venture that Kathy just mentioned, in just raising our spirits and minds about racial justice as we pray. And we also talked about how much we respected. We all happen to be Anglo or white people in our small group, how much we respected our brothers and sisters of color during our Sacred Ground classwork and after our Sacred Ground classwork as we were forming what became the Racial Justice Task Force. But first of all, they shared their stories with us, and it must have been hard to do that. And they listened to us, and we learned the importance of listening to them. They also were very brave and loving and told us they weren't going to do the work for us. They said, you all need to do this learning and deciding and understanding on your own as white people. We'll be there to support you, but we aren't going to do it for you. And that was an important wake-up call to me, I know. And yet, we respect them also because they came in and did the work with us much sooner than we expected. So it truly became, this last 18 months became a more unified learning and acting experience together. And I want to thank those of you who wanted to at first just be our advisors and became our partners very quickly. We couldn't do any of this without you. Another thing we talked about at some length was our interaction with the materials of Sacred Ground and how it struck us in terms of our education as young people in school and even later as adults who thought we were pretty sophisticated in the real world. And the Sacred Ground materials, but more importantly, our discussions in groups during the class taught us that there are a lot of details we did not know and a lot of listening we needed to do as well as our reading and discussing. And, you know, St. Margaret's is famous for having highly educated people in its congregation, and I think all of us feel like we weren't as educated as we thought. And then finally, as many of you have already said, there is so much to be done. And none of us really know the whole picture of how we should reach out and be more inclusive and unified as a congregation, but we know we need to reach out into our larger community and to other churches that may have a more non-white ethnic makeup than we have, whether they're Episcopal churches or other denominations. And we need to reach out to the community as a whole. I think consensus was that St. Margaret's isn't nearly as racially diverse as we would hope it could become. Anything else you'd like to mention from my group? That's it.
Thank you, Jackie. Appreciate it. So before we go into our break, I have 3 comments. One, think about this work on a systemic level. So in our country and our culture, we have a status quo. And the status quo currently is white people have privilege, people of color do not, and everything. And that's a gross oversimplification. But what we're doing in this work is challenging the status quo. What we're trying to do is force the system to adopt a new status quo where people of color and white people are on the same level. Anytime in any system, no matter how big or how small, people are trying to change the status quo, there will be resistance. The status quo is the status quo because it's comfortable. So just keep that in the back of your mind. The second thing I want to say is Kathleen and others who brought up the prayers of the people, excellent. There's a theological idea that praying shapes believing. The more we enter into this work in prayer, both individual and corporate, the more we can internalize this work and be empowered by God for the success of this work. So keep up those prayers of the people. Deliberately pray about this. Pray with each other about this. And, you know, people will often say, well, what can I do? Well, the number one answer, my response is you can always pray. Regardless of anything else, we can all pray. And then the third thing I'm going to leave you with before I break is a story. When I was a Good Shepherd in Silver Spring, I had been there about 6 years, and we were in the ramp up to the 2016 election. And I had a parishioner whom I really do adore to this day. I have never met a human being with a greater capacity for hospitality. She also drove me up a wall because she was a committed Trump supporter. And we were sort of she had planned an event after church. We would have a monthly sort of pizza and game session, which I really loved. And you know, it's one of those things you just kind of walk into without really being self-aware. And we started this conversation about Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump, and you know, and we started doing this, and you know, and it was, she would say something, and I would react with a little bit more force, and she would react with a little bit more force, and I would react with a little bit more force. And in the back of my head, and this is the grace of God, I heard this voice say, "You really need to stop." Mm-hmm. Because you can win this argument, but it will be at the expense of this relationship. You really need to stop because this has the potential to make this person leave this parish. Because I had my collar on. We were, you know, going back and forth, and it got hot. So finally, I sort of physically took a step back, took a deep breath, and she said her next really valid point, and I simply said, "I love you." And she said her next really valid point, and I said, "I love you." And she said her third really valid point, and I said, "I love you." And that's when she heard me. But if I had not been prompted by the Holy Spirit to do that, I would have lost that relationship. And I ran the risk of depriving Good Shepherd of the one person who really does embody Christian hospitality. And really did, it was her ministry to take care of the community and to build relationships. And it would have been a real tragedy just to get, for my own satisfaction of winning a political argument. So I tell you this story as a cautionary tale that self-awareness is really important in this work. It is really important to give yourself permission to feel the feelings you feel. And it is really important, if you hurt someone else's feelings and realize it, please go apologize. And you can You don't have to justify it. You can just say, I'm sorry. I love you. It is more important for me to be in relationship with you, to be in right relationship with you, than it is to win a political argument. That's a very, very countercultural position. That's a very countercultural position in Washington. But it's a very important position. And that is, I think, who we are called to do and be as followers of Jesus Christ, as members of the Jesus movement, as Christians in this country. That is what we have to offer. So go on your break. I think we're a little behind schedule, but we've got at least 10 minutes. So all right, make it 9, and we'll be back after this.
I just want to speak to a bit of process before turning it back over to David and getting to the meat of generating all of the ideas that we're carrying with us about what we might do next. We're going to generate a lot of ideas, and we're going to have more ideas than we have bandwidth for as a parish. Maybe, we'll see. We're not going to try and reach consensus on a strategic plan for what we do next as a racial justice task force. That's outside of the scope of what we can accomplish in the next hour. But we are going to take everything. We're going to put it up into the shared Google Doc and document it. And then Annika and Jackie, as the co-chairs of the Racial Justice Task Force, Diana and I as the clergy, along with our senior warden, Giselle Pohl, will meet to pray over all of these things that have been submitted and make some recommendations around what seems to make sense for prioritization of all the ideas submitted and how we might begin to operationalize them as a racial justice task force moving forward. Now, some of you here have taught it twice. Some of you here have just finished. Some of you did it 18 months ago and have been in the racial justice task force. So to frame, make sure we're all kind of on as close to the same page as we can be to frame the next step conversation. We're gonna have a refresh of the framework of the Becoming Beloved Community quadrants. Last time we had this kind of retreat, it was very helpful to kind of put into the categories. It'll make sense in a moment. I'm not gonna try and do that now. And to hear from Annika and Jackie a brief summary for those who may not be in the know of what the Racial Justice Task Force has done in the past 12 months. So we have that in our minds, informing what's done next. By virtue of you being here, regardless whether you took Sacred Ground the first time around and you have or have not been involved in the monthly Racial Justice Task Force meetings over the past year, and regardless if you have just completed Sacred Ground, we are all invited to continue the work. So it's up to you how you engage after today in joining the meetings on a monthly basis and making a bigger cohort of the 40 to remain actively engaged and inform what the parish does next. Any questions on process? So after we meet, we would bring what the co-chairs and clergy and senior warden have discerned to our next monthly meeting so that we present that and hopefully have some buy-in that makes good, that looks good. And then look to schedule a parish-wide meeting in which we report back all that's been transpired today in the past year and what our intentions are moving forward. Yes, Russ.
Hello. Some of us in the Racial Justice Task Force have been reading Peter Jarrett Schell's book about reparations and the church, and I'm just wondering what role that's going to play in, or if it's going to play a role.
That's up for this group to make recommendations of how and if it might play a role when we get to just soliciting of ideas. And I assume Annika and Jackie will just speak to that fact that that's happening when they report what's been done in the past year. Any other initial questions? Any questions on Zoom?
Okay, welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a good break. We're going to take just a moment to talk about the quadrant that comes to us out of the Becoming Beloved Community program. Just a word about becoming beloved community and the way of love. This, as you all know, has been a big push from our current presiding bishop, Bishop Michael Curry. All of us in Washington, D.C. are familiar with the concept of an administration change. Next year in Louisville, in General Convention, we will elect a new presiding bishop. Whoever is elected presiding bishop will come in with new program initiatives and a new focus, which means that if becoming beloved community in the way of love remain important, it falls to all of us to make sure that they continue to move forward. So I just want to highlight that fact because I actually think they're both becoming beloved community and the way of love are real gifts to the church. And I would really hate to see us lose it simply because we have an administration change. But just be aware that there will be a new focus by a new presiding bishop. It is perfectly legitimate for us to hold on to the things from this presiding bishop's administration that give us life, that feed our souls, and that empower our work. Okay? All right. There are, oh, excellent. Thank you for that. So here we have 4 quadrants from the becoming beloved community. And there's a labyrinth, which is, you know, for those of you who can pray a labyrinth, you can find this online. And if you aren't able to physically walk it, you can trace it with your finger and sort of be intentional that way. So the first quadrant is telling the truth. The second is proclaiming the dream. The third is practicing the way of love. And the fourth is repairing the breach, which is it Russ? Is that? So, right, that's where the reparations goes. And actually, I would argue it goes in other places too, but it really belongs right there. So as we think about the conversations we've had this morning, think about your experience of Sacred Ground here at St. Margaret's, and then use those reflections. What would you like to see happen next? And you can, if you need help, you can use one or more than one of each one of these 4 areas to frame sort of what you think needs to happen next. So, for instance, just to use Russ's example and his, you know, repairing the breach. What do we need to do? So we're going to read Peter Jarrett Shell's book on reparations. There is currently a diocesan task force on reparations working on this very question for the diocese. So we can get involved in that work at the diocesan level. We can make sure that we network with other parishes so that when the next reparations resolution comes to the floor of our diocesan convention, that there's a lot of support for it. We can go to diocesan convention even if we are not the elected representatives from our respective parishes and talk to people who are at convention. Convention is actually an open meeting. So that's an example of concrete things that we can do next that fit into one of these 4 areas. We were just realizing we might have gotten something slightly out of order and that we would like to actually hear a report from the Racial Social Justice Task Force before we get into the idea generation piece.
Thank you. I think I'm supposed to kick off our report. Annika?
Yes, go for it. We'll just alternate.
First of all, thank you so much, everyone who has participated on the task force. We had kind of a preliminary meeting last July and have been rolling ever since, a year ago July. So it's been 14 months or so that we've been doing this work. One of the projects that had preceded the task force and continues is researching and documenting our parish history. And Farah Elliott and John and Kathy have been working on this together and separately for a long time. We look forward to having our parish history related to race and racial injustice, documented so we can share it with the full congregation as part of our truth-telling action.
One of the other activities that we've been able to work on over the past 14 months that's been mentioned is the supplier diversity program. And so with this, what we did is it was a labor of love. Truly, Anamita did so much work for it, and Kathy too, to take our small idea, our mustard seed, and build it out into something so amazing. And so with this, it provides a little bit of framework and guidance around who we are using as vendors at the church and where we're the local businesses essentially that we're supporting. So ensuring that there's more equity and that there is diversity in those that we are considering, so that we can be more intentional with where our finances are being used with the church budget.
And I just have to add, that was an amazing feat in my mind, because I know what other churches have gone through trying to establish something like our supplier diversity program. And from being an idea in September to a draft resolution, thanks to Anamita, and many revisions, and then our vestry approving it last December. In 4 months' time, we went from an idea to action, and I really think St. Margaret's can do more like that. Another thing we did about the same time was the District of Columbia government asked us to contribute to its racial equity action plan for the entire district. And so we gathered input from the congregation and from the task force and sent that in last December.
And then it was something that I know Russ just recently mentioned too, but we are reading a book called Reparations by Peter Jarrett Shell. And it's been an impactful book as we've been looking at it. It's right here next to me if you want to see a visual of it. But it's a plan for churches in discussing and moving forward with reparations. And so as one of the branches of the last listening session that we did as a parish, it became apparent that there was interest, but a lot of reservation. And so what we wanted to do is learn a little bit more about potentially a way forward. So the Racial Justice Task Force has been working our way through the book in hopes that it could become something that would be then part of a wider parish discussion as we look to move forward and potentially use the plan for our own St. Margaret's if the parish is ready for that, and that's where the Spirit is leading, to be able to build off of that plan and then move toward a form of reparations as a parish as well.
We have been following Diana's lead in encouraging people to take sacred ground as a learning experience. And we were delighted to be included as the Racial Justice Task Force in the ministry fair on the 17th. And from that, we got 3 people who are sacred ground completers who are interested in joining our task force work. And we'll probably actually include them officially in January, but we've reached out to them already this week and they sound excited about it. And there were several other people who were interested in signing up for the Sacred Ground Learning Experience the next time it's offered. So thanks to Diana for including us in that work.
Yeah. And then with one of the things that we've been talking about is the use of spirituals in worship and in our services. So if you might recall, we had a forum where we had an expert speaker come in and just kind of lead the discussion on that. In addition, there have been the listening session and a few other touch points with the parish, because ultimately this is something that, as when we were first beginning, we really wanted to make sure that this was not just something that was a few people. We wanted this to be something that was the work of a parish and lay led, so that there could be momentum behind it and scalability, and inviting more and more of the parish to join the work and continue the work. And so there have been a few different forums and events that have been able to allow for continued learning as a group. So regardless of whether somebody has participated in Sacred Ground or not, to be able to lend their voice and help direct the trajectory of the Racial Justice Task Force.
And finally, among the things that we are continuing, thanks to Kathy Connolly's initial suggestion that we focus some regular prayers of the people on racial justice, current events and historical events, and figures that we can emulate. For several months, we've been having, not every week, but most weeks, a prayer submitted by a member of the Racial Justice Task Force. Like our seminarians are having classes in how to write collects, we're trying to write racial justice prayers. And we have an online submission form that people can sign up from the task force to prepare a prayer and submit it through our portal. So I'm glad to hear feedback today that has been a meaningful experience to hear those prayers almost every week.
And as we look ahead, there's a lot of things that from this conversation and the ones that will come after, and just being able to mold it, we know will come. But one of the things that we had hoped to do was to be able to have a discussion around the reparations book by Peter Jarrett Shell, but invite a larger group of people beyond just the task force to be able to participate in that discussion and determine our way forward. And as part of that, some of the things that you've heard today about looking at our history, both ancient and more recent and lived, including the ongoing learning, including our intentionality with where we're putting our money in developing relationships. So there's been movement in some of those areas, but there's still so much more work that needs to be done. And so we were hoping that potentially this ongoing discussion would welcome more people into that and help us gain momentum as a parish.
And just a final comment from me. One of the things early on the task force decided to do was to focus on action. We have a marvelous formation program at St. Margaret's, and we're definitely tying into that. But we're trying to carve out our niche in terms of social justice and racial justice action. And so we, as Annika just said, there's so much to do. St. Margaret's has a lot of energy, and we just welcome more people into the work.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for that report. Appreciate it. It sounds like y'all are doing really good work. All right, so now we're ready to talk about ideas for action items. Okay. So I think what we're going to do is just sort of popcorn style. As you have a inspiration, I'll write it down in the newsprint. Richard will record it on the computers. You'll be able to see it on that screen as well. And one of the next steps for Diana, Richard, and me after this morning is to evaluate what comes next. But we're also, I think we'll also take that time to sort of help place all of these ideas in the quadrant.
I think this, I've got two thoughts. I think they are under repairing the breach. I'll renew a comment I made last year, which is merging our congregation talent and treasure into St. Luke's, which I know is not a popular idea. But secondly, and in context with the very good toxic charity course that Richard offered a few years ago, rather than deciding how to partner with communities of color, perhaps partnering with Howard University and asking it how to partner with communities of color.
I don't know where this one falls, but for the task force to just encourage periodic field trips to local places. And it could be as easy as somebody has an idea and gets a half a dozen people to go and then tells the whole parish when it's going to happen. So that way, and this isn't just for Sacred Ground graduates, but for all, so that we can have a personal experience and a social experience simultaneously.
So I've recently had lunch with a Methodist, a Quaker, and my Jewish friend, and in all of their congregations, they're doing this work. They took this course. They don't call it Sacred Ground, but it has another name. and they're all looking at the issue of reparations. And I think we should look into some interfaith alliance and just maybe merge our resources. The the synagogue is looking at forgiveness of medical debt, and another group was looking at also reparations in the healthcare field. So I think rather than reinvent the wheel, we could partner with other faiths.
In the area of education, since it's quite a commitment to take this course, we could have more seminars, sessions where people could be exposed maybe through using film or using speakers to some of the discrimination we were exposed to in the course. There's, a way to keep continuously educate the parish about this issue. That's one idea.
Great, thanks, Patty. People on Zoom, do you have ideas you want to jump in with?
One thing that has been suggested indirectly, but I think we need to continue to work on meeting people where they're at. Not having the racial justice work be a committee or a fragment of our congregation, but having it to be the way St. Margaret's is. Everybody's included, in other words.
So Jackie, just to clarify, you would like to see this work integrated into the whole of the parish?
Yes, I think the Racial Justice Task Force can continue to be a catalyst, but I wouldn't want our congregation as a whole to think it's just a niche of a particular ministry. It is who we are as a parish.
Great, thank you. So really what you're advocating is an assumption of a parish identity.
It sounds good.
Okay, all right.
Adding on to number 5 is I think we can do education after the service, so we still have our captive audience. And we used to do it sitting out in the parish hall, but talk about our experiences the way that we talked about it today. How was I changed, or what do I do differently now that I've been through this course? And then that might encourage people to join, but it also keeps that conversation going, and it helps illustrate the powerfulness of the course.
So I have a couple of suggestions, and one of them is on a personal level, that we encourage everyone in the parish, whether or not they've been involved in Sacred Ground or Racial Justice Task Force, to create a personal practice that is both experiential and spiritual of every day. And this is asking a lot, perhaps, every day thinking of one instance that made you aware of racial issues, either out in the society as a whole or in a personal interaction. And jot it down. It doesn't have to be anything elaborate, but see if you can create this daily practice. I see it personally as a spiritual practice as well. And I think partly faith and action will be definitely encouraged by this, because it's very easy, if you're a white person, not to have to think about this every day. And as was pointed out at the beginning, let's see if we can think about it every day. And especially if we have taken an action like responding to another person who is doing something that is a little bit questionable or racist, are we brave enough to speak up diplomatically but firmly about that? So that's number 1, personal practice. Number 2 is it kind of pulls together, it was an idea I've been mulling over for quite a while, is that we do an event for Black History Month, for Asian American Month. It brings together the idea of field trips and of education, but I'd like to see every month at least, a regular program of something that we're offering to the parish as a whole to participate in. One thing, maybe two things, but without overloading our schedule, I think this can be coordinated really well. And that Black History is not just in Black History Month, it could be this month. And I am going to put myself right out there and say, I'd really be willing to help coordinate this effort because I think it's so important. Keep it on the front page of who we are.
And thank you very much for that. So I wanted to, I love this idea about journaling every day. As an extrovert, I won't do it. And, you know, so I would encourage you and suggestion to consciously think about racial incidences, history, interactions every day is supremely valid. For those of us who are extroverts, that might actually be committing to have a conversation every day or having a prayer partner with someone every day. And to remember that when we hear suggestions like this, that, you know, quite frankly, the idea of journaling every day makes my teeth itch, but I love the basis of the idea. So I want to encourage all of us, don't dismiss any of these ideas out of hand. Tailor them to fit your learning style, your inclinations, and, you know, and this, you know, and think, you know, not just about the content, but I mean, not just about the actions implied, but also about the, use your imagination is really what I'm trying to say. And because, so Anne, thank you so much for that. And then the second one, I'll just give you a quick vignette. When I was a Good Shepherd, we were blessed to have every member of the African diaspora represented. We had African Americans, we had Afro-Caribbeans, we had West Africans. And during February for Black History Month, many of the women in the parish who were members of the African diaspora decided to have a special coffee hour, and they all made and brought their indigenous dishes and taught us sort of the cultural significance of each dish and listed the ingredients and talked about how labor intensive it was. And, you know, this particular dish only gets made for these events in our culture. And this particular dish gets made every Sunday. And it was really eye-opening, and it was great because everyone was like, ooh, food. But so, you know, again, get creative about your ideas. There are lots of ways to engage this work. It doesn't have to be sitting down, reading a book and having a conversation. It could be, there's a whole lot of ways to conceive of continuing to educate ourselves about race and the history of race in this country. So, Anne, thank you for that.
I just wanted to add something on that I think fits exactly with what you're saying. Last Black History Month, Paige came to me and said, well, you know, I'm tired that we're always doing something that talks about the ways in which people of color have been harmed, because there's so much about who I am and who we are that's positive, that's life-giving. And so she and her dad talked about Black sororities and fraternities. And it was a wonderful forum that taught me, and I assume other people, something I didn't know about that whole sort of culture. And for her, it was, I mean, she loves it and her dad loves it. And it was a, you know, a big part of their lives. And it took our understanding broadly from a place of just disparity to life.
Right. It helped complete the picture.
Can you hear me? I'm wearing a headset, yes. So I just want to, okay, great. So a few of the thoughts that came to mind, especially when Jackie was commenting, and then I think you framed her comment as, I can't remember if it was something like, I've forgotten the wording that you chose, but it was something to the effect of the identity of the parish, the identity of a shift in the whole identity. I was thinking a little bit about how do we even know that we have a culture? right? Many of us aren't aware that we all have cultures, multiple maybe, and we kind of learn those in a way that's almost it's this transparent or lacking in transparency is the air we breathe, right? So there's some things that I would hope that the congregation just starts to have so inherently in its patterns that the person who comes in or the person who's a part of it doesn't even think about the fact that it's permeating the culture of this community, right? And so I'm not sure what that looks like. I'm not trying to suggest specifics here, but one thing that I thought about was in my work, we do something called a pulse survey, where it's just a kind of short questions that we have to, in our organization, my federal agency had some of the lowest ranking in the entire federal government in terms of employee satisfaction. And it's risen more than any organization has, I think, in just 2 years because of the way it took some steps, right? But we have these pulse surveys. So I'm thinking it's like I said before, it's important for me to understand from the perspective of some of the people who are currently in the room. I can see a few that I know well from Sacred Ground. You know, I want to understand this from the perspective of people who've been a part of St. Margaret's for several decades, as well as new people. And I wonder if there's a way to construct, like based on the values that we hope that people would feel as a part of the congregation, it's some form of a very brief pulse survey that could be used periodically to just take the pulse of the congregation on how are people feeling from different demographic perspectives, the way we would hope in terms of feeling included or centered, or, you know, I'm not going to try to say what the survey should say.
Thank you.
So that's my thought. And then I also think that the clergy and the vestry are member in any congregation, but I think the clergy can also bring the message as they have as standard into the worship service itself. So how that gets framed, not only in the prayers, but also from the pulpit in terms of the preaching. Oh, and then the third thing is we had a discussion about taking a pilgrimage to the Legacy Museum. I think our first meetings, wasn't feasible or something might be great to consider. And did I call that's the new museum that was down in, I think it was, oh, I said, I hope I used the right term, the Legacy Museum. I think people understand what I mean. Yeah.
The museum in Montgomery, Alabama?
Yes. If we, it seemed like a good way to have a pilgrimage. Some churches go to Israel, right? I mean,
right.
You know.
Concerning number 6, we go back.
Could you just read number 6, Helen? What is number?
As here, continue to meet people where they are, include everyone in the parish. Identity versus niche. How do we say that? Asking for leadership in this, just to see who's in leadership positions, seminarians that might represent others than Caucasians. I wonder why we have, why we can't have those of other races as our seminarians, because they're in a position to be seen.
So here's
show the identity that we're trying to.
Helen, thank you for that thought. And I've heard a couple of thoughts over the morning about, you know, we need more fill in the blank. Yes, and numbers are a thing. And so, and what I mean by that is there are still majority minority populations. And so we're not, none of us are likely to, there just are not enough people of color to satisfy the white need to see brown faces in the congregation. just to be real blunt. No, I appreciate that. But no, right. And so please don't hear me picking on you. I'm actually speaking to everybody. That is especially true for the population from our seminaries, because there are this year's incoming class, there are 30 seminarian first years at VTS and 100 field ed sites. And so just the numbers are going to work against that suggestion. And I think, Helen, you're exactly right. We have to continuously be conscious of that so that when we do encounter someone who is a person of color who comes through the door, that we greet them and say good morning and make them feel welcome. I mean, I can't tell you the number of times I've been speaking to friends who are people of color, and actually some white people too, who walk into an Episcopal church on Sunday morning and no one says a word. I mean, or even worse, right? Okay.
David, let me say I love you.
Okay, thank you.
But let me also say that no other comment was responded to in the way that you're responding to this one.
Okay.
Just to me, some anxiety on your part, defensiveness. Secondly, you know, this is a corporate answer.
Mm-hmm.
We can't find enough people of color. We're trying, but we can't find them. We are the good ones. We can't find them. And I think that's a very dishonest reaction. If we wish people of color to join the parish, they need to see themselves in the service. And we need to create a community that invites people of color here, both as parishioners and as leaders. And that, in my view, is the underpinning of what all of this is about. And I'm afraid that your comment, for me, defeats that foundation.
Thank you.
That is my ouch.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate you saying that. And I will tell you that my reactivity to that is that this is an ongoing conversation in other areas than here. And it is something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about. So, but I also really appreciate you taking the model so that we can have this conversation. So thank you.
But the model in response that you laid out for us in the beginning was to apologize. And I don't hear that.
Okay. So I apologize. It was not my intention to in any way discount either you personally, Helen, or the work that's being done here. And my comment came out of frustrating conversations I've had in other areas. And so it had happened to touch sort of one of my own personal hotspots. So I do, and Helen, I apologize to you because I feel like I singled you out, but yeah, so.
Thank you, David.
You're welcome. And no, and I love you too. Thank you, because this is exactly the kind of awkward and uncomfortable, but really important interaction. So this has been very good. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Jackie had mentioned earlier some feedback we had given to the district government, and I was just thinking we might want to try to regularize contacts with the government to sort of be involved with whatever racial reconciliation projects they were working on. To sort of tap into those and see if we could participate in some way.
Oh, sorry, Maggie, you had your hand up?
I just want to take a moment to say, wow, that conversation was so powerful that we just had. And it's part of why I think this is such a I feel so blessed to be a part of St. Margaret's. And, because even listening, my heart went in a lot of directions. As a former seminarian, like I was feeling for David a little bit because I understood where he was coming from. And then I was thinking, well, let's not tokenize people, but at this stage, because I was worried about tokenizing seminary students because they are under a lot of pressure. And They have to be able to find their own path in terms of their own spiritual development. And it's really like not for the, there's a lot that goes into being in seminary. By the way, there's people who go into seminary. I just was in a day-long meeting, and we have very high ACE scores, which means we can have very high adverse childhood experiences. It's a really interesting thing to look at the demographics and also the mental health of clergy. So maybe I'm going to give voice to that. Like, let's make sure that when we are bringing in people, that we're doing a lot of extra effort, because when thank you, Julie. Julie, I'm the extrovert. I know I do really well enough. She's been anyway, tag team, but spiritual tag team. But you know, it's just kind of so I was like almost on a path, like with everyone as I was listening to everyone talk, and then at the end of it, I brought my hand down and then brought it up again. I brought it down because I thought I don't need to say anything, and that was a really beautiful exchange because it allowed for confrontation. And we can't see change without that. And so, but I also do want to say that there is a mental health component to being in seminary, and it's it's hard to put words to. And then there's also a mental health component to being a clergy leader. And we do see that we have very high rates of stress and distress amongst our clergy. So whatever we do, even as we try to make sure that the congregation, it looks like who we want to be, that we are doing the right thing and putting those supports in place.
Thank you. Lou.
Yeah, I was just going to say, this morning, we had 70+ people of color, volunteers and participants in Charlie's Place, who are actually part of our community. We need to figure out how we can incorporate who they are as who we are, because they are part of our community. They come in here Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, and they know they're in St. Margaret's. So we need to recognize that they are part of our community.
Thank you. Julie?
Hi, thanks. I was reflecting back, you were telling the story about your parishioner who had been a Trump supporter and learning to stay in conversation. And I wonder about training in having those conversations, which is different than having the knowledge about our racial history. And I think I'm curious about more contextualizing about that, because I work in a social justice organization. A lot of my coworkers are younger people of color, and there is such a thing as a desire for safety. And so when is the push for we need to all stay in conversation, we need to all be in this place, going to be perhaps the noble and right thing to do, but how does that stay in tension with, and we want to have a more diverse congregation. We want to put leadership of color in front of this congregation that may have people who believe things that are counter to their ultimate flourishing. And it's something I struggle with a lot, because I still tend to avoid a lot of those conversations because I can't. I go to a progressive church and I work at a progressive organization, and I don't talk to the part of my family that doesn't agree with a lot of that stuff. And I know that's not a position of courage, but it's wondering if there are people teaching real conversation skills, really focused on that in a social situation, or to other people in whatever group you're in, employment or family or church, how to have those conversations, or how to support the safety of others who may not feel as safe with somebody, while also trying to pull in somebody to a better place of fuller understanding of justice and love.
Thank you very much for that. And there are groups and organizations around the country who do training. And the idea is having fierce conversations. I know that Anne Marie Jeffrey, who's on the bishop's staff, has actually participated in a training like that. So you can find her contact information on the Diocese of Washington's website, and she can probably point you to at least one organization that offers that training. And there are probably many more too.
So I wanted to just mention that there are a few topics that really haven't come up here in terms of our actions in the future and out in the immediate world. And one of them is immigration. The majority, I think, of immigrants today are people of color. There have been concerted efforts to deprive them of the basic needs that they have. Number two is voting rights. Number three is employment rights. And number four is housing. So these are all areas where action is critical, and the political climate that we're in is threatening all of this. And I just want to put these out here because these are areas where individuals can volunteer and do some work that is actually going to help.
Thank you for that. Oh, Maggie?
Just a reminder, it's now noon, so we probably want to finish up our comments.
A seminar on the 1619 project. I've not really delved into that. Highlighting Black authors and journalists' work. Checking our investments to see if we have some poor investments. And then journalists as part of our seminars or whatever. And we're getting 2151 California Street as a mixed income project up where I live. And it's going to be something in the future that we may help meet the needs of the residents that are going to be coming in our areas. They were here at the church a week and a half ago presenting their project, and we should just stay informed of their progress and consider it in the future.
Maggie, you had your hand up?
Yes, I raised my hand for something about Lou's comment earlier around the people who are in Charlie's place. And I just want to offer up that when I did my field, I think I've mentioned this before, but when I did my field placement for seminary at St. Mary's in Harlem, I did interviews with a lot of the long-term congregants, people from the congregation, and that they also had a similar ministry, but there was no way of knowing from the ministry to the church who was being served and who was actually unhoused. I mean, because they had at some point something that happened, and it was like pivotal moments where they suddenly realized that the people they were serving could actually be the leaders in the effort of serving, and everything just shifted. And so I never could really tell if the people that I was interacting with in the congregation, who I would also see on movie night with Paige's cousin Lisa, who I knew were actually unhoused. I didn't know, right? And it was a wonderful experience. And I know that I have that paper somewhere, and I can share that if it's of interest with Richard and Diana and others, because I interviewed some congregation members, I think, who have now passed away, who talked about what happened with their pastors and when they had this shift and they stopped. They lost the boundary in a way, and I think it worked. And they're a similar size congregation with some similar demographics. So,
thank you.
I just wanted to say that I'm very impressed with the creative 23 points that this group has come up with looking forward. But through that lens, I want to give thanks to the very powerful leadership of Annika and Jackie, who over the last 18 months have really, I think, shaped a path forward for this parish and this group. And without them, we would not be where we are today. So thank you so much, Jackie and Annika.
This is Ron, and I, of course, second Kathy's acclaim for our co-chair's work. Lou's comment about Charlie's Place brought in clearer focus for me something that's been swimming in my head as I listen to all of this. And I don't know if this is useful or not, but it seems like some of these ideas are about St. Margaret's work in the world. Some of these ideas are about how in our current demographic, we can learn more about the ills of the world in our adjacent community and more broadly. And some of them have to do with how we can make it clear that our demographic is open to change to reflect the diversity that is increasingly, characteristic of American society. And I just remembered at Charlie's Place Bible study last Tuesday, I had a conversation with one of the clients about how God works in our lives and conversations with God. And one of the comments that he made was, and he was a man of my age or older, he said, people of my generation still have those conversations, but the young folks don't even think about God. And I don't know where that leads me, except if we're thinking about how to make ourselves more open and welcoming, part of it has to do with evangelism in a way, and kind of helping people to understand the role that faith can play in building a more whole life, a life of integrity and of hope, which I think are issues that are closely related to how we deal with racial justice. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Oh, okay. All right.
I just, for the sake of documenting it, want to make sure we capture some ideas that have been floating, but I know I'm eager for some pulse taking on the question of whether Sacred Ground should be offered a third time. And if so, who's feeling called to lead it? So as we meet after this and discern next steps, I need help, from my point of view, ranking that, because it takes resources and people and time to run it. So Sacred Ground 3.0 question mark, that's one. The reparations book, so that's been put out there, already been discussed as an idea of reading it in a wider context, whether that's with the vestry, whether that's inviting the entire parish to read it together. So want to make sure that gets documented. Yeah. And I also would like to thank David for the brave conversation that's been modeled earlier, and be vulnerable enough to share with you that Helen's comment struck a chord with me too. So I've been trying to process, why is that? And I know that as a leader, we hear a lot about, we want the parish to be more diverse. And I want that too, with all of my heart. And I think it creates discomfort in me as a leader when I don't have the answer to how to just make that happen, right? So what I've tried to do in my own work on myself, which may or may not translate into the reality at St. Margaret's, is being mindful about how am I contributing to making people of color welcome in the church community that I've been called to lead as a white person, as a white priest who has succeeded a Black priest as rector. And I have noted and lamented the fact that under Kim's tenure, I think we had more people of color and more interracial couples, being that Kim and Mark kind of modeled an interracial couple. I happen to be a member of an interracial couple, but that hasn't really translated in the same way. So I'm just acknowledging it. I don't have a solution, but I just wanted to acknowledge it with some vulnerability that's been on my heart and mind over the course of my tenure. I try and really intentionally keep in touch with the members of color of St. Margaret's when they don't show up, following up, trying to get a few families in particular to really come back and always be open to listening. But I'm challenging myself to always, when I invite people to church, to imagine the ripple effect that that could have, knowing that everyone who comes to a church for the first time, in all the surveys that have ever been done that measure how that happens, it's not good marketing, that helps. It's not your website. Yeah, that still helps too. It's a personal invitation from someone that you knew. So us playing all of our collective part, if we want to make St. Margaret's more racially diverse, is to invite people that you know in your life. And if we don't have many people of color in our lives to invite, that could be a next step for us personally to work on. So again, I don't have all the answers. Wanted to acknowledge that, the comment or non-white seminarians, more diverse, racially diverse leadership for those of us who are in leadership. It's like, yes, I want that too. And is my role as a leader to make space and step aside? Things that we're constantly discerning. Just want to put that up.
Thanks, Richard.
Thank you. And I just want to jump on that. It's like inviting people like Rochelle and Karan, Gwen, and, inviting so that we have clergy of color on like a regular basis coming in and helping to provide that feeling when someone comes in and or just kind of peeks in, they can see, hey, this is a place where you can feel comfortable too. That'd be good. I wanted to jump on number 1. Black Lives Matter. I just think we or 2, I don't remember what it was, where we were talking about partnering with Howard University and stuff. And I'm just like, I think Black Lives Matter has done a lot of work and has a lot of insight as to how we can help the Black community, at the very least, just here in DC. So yeah, a chapter of the Black Lives community that's here that we can partner with and learn from and support, and listen to. That's it.
So if you leave today and 5 minutes after leaving, you think of one more thing that you just really wish had been said, email us and I'll add it to the list. Anything that comes in before we have the meeting, is fair game.